Hello, and welcome to another fur-tastic episode of Furries in the Media, the series that reviews videos and other media based on how the furry fandom is represented. So Abergwine, what are we covering today? Well, Sam, today we're going to take a look at a YouTube video from 2018 called Furries Surprise Strangers for the First Time. It's a video with 3 Portland locals who are asked what they know about furries, while 2 furries surreptitiously walk up behind them, and then they all sit down and talk with the furries. That sounds interesting. Is this another video from Jubilee? No, but the format is awfully reminiscent of Jubilee's style. This one's from BuzzFeedVideo. BuzzFeed? Don't they just post clickbait? Well, yeah, they kinda do, but that doesn't mean that this video is gonna be bad, Sam. Well, if you say so. You guys probably already know what BuzzFeed is. It's an American media, news, and entertainment company that mostly focuses on digital media. Their YouTube channel, BuzzFeedVideo, has more than 7,000 videos and boasts more than 20 million subscribers. While some videos on the channel are part of a series, this video, Furry Surprise Strangers for the First Time, doesn't seem to be part of a larger series or playlist. If you do decide to watch this video for yourself, be aware that there is some mature language, but the worst of it is censored. So, without further ado, let's get into it. The video starts off with a title card stating, on August 2nd, 2018, we invited 3 Portland locals for a surprise. We're then introduced to these 3 locals, starting with Alyssa, who is asked by someone off camera what she thinks is going to happen today, and Alyssa responds that she has no idea. We're then introduced to Marcus, who is asked what he knows about the furry community. Marcus takes a beat and laughs in response. Lastly, we're introduced to Joni, who seems to not know what furries are, as she asks if furry is the name of them or if they're referring to general furry animals. We cut back to Marcus, who says that furries have sex with tails on. Back with Joni, we hear a person off camera asking, what do you know about furries specifically? And she answers that she knows nothing. Again, we cut back to Marcus saying that they dress up like Star Fox and then have sex with each other, as we see 2 furries quietly walking up behind him. Marcus becomes suspicious, asking, is there a furry behind me? And he turns around to see the 2 furries. We cut to Alyssa meeting the 2 furries for herself, and then to Joni meeting them as well.
Oh, hi. Oh my gosh. You guys are... Wait.
Aw, her reaction is adorable. Oh, I know. We come back to Marcus, who says that he feels bad for laughing in person because this is much different. We're then given a proper introduction to the 2 furries. First up is Lumio Draco, a celestial moondragon. The other furry introduces his persona as Haven Fusky, and he says that he's been in the fandom for 4 years. Lumio says he's been in the fandom for 7 years. Now we have the 2 furries sitting across from each of the Portland locals, starting with Marcus. Marcus says he's never had one of those moments where the people he was talking about were right behind him, but as soon as he started making jokes about furries, he heard them sneaking up behind him. He jokes that they must not commit a lot of crimes because they can't sneak up on anybody, and they all have a good laugh about it. Lumio explains to Joni that the furry community is made up of enthusiasts of anthropomorphic animals, which means animals with human-like characteristics. Marcus says that he's had so many questions, but now he's frozen, joking that it's because the furries look like they could hurt him if they felt like it, which prompts a laugh from Haven. Joni notices that Lumio doesn't have any fur. Lumio says he is what's called a scaly. Marcus asks if how they're dressed is how they see themselves. Haven says yes, it's called a fursona. Alyssa asks where they usually go in character. Lumio says wherever there's an opportunity. He goes on to explain that the furry community has their own conventions that they go to. Haven says that other than conventions, he goes out to clubs in his fursuit, and that he's also done parades and charities, going to children's hospitals to brighten their day. Lumio explains that they have a group that is devoted to doing this on a weekly basis to cheer up the children. Alyssa exclaims, that's incredible! Marcus asks how white furry is. Haven says that he doesn't know the statistics, but Lumio says it's pretty white. Haven says that there is a group that started doing POC-focused room parties. As Haven mentions room parties, we are provided with a definition stating room party, parties in hotel rooms during conventions. Haven states that the furry community is very open across the spectrum of LGBT. We're back with Lumio sitting alone in his chair, explaining that one of the fandom's biggest diversities is how furries come from a wide spectrum of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. Haven says that he's been an out and openly gay man for many years, and what he's found with the community is that because everyone exists as their characters, that they are much more likely to open up. Lumio says that a lot of people who enter the community are very pressured to be someone that they're not, but that by creating a persona, they can alter that and have the ability to discover who they really are from a third-person perspective. Alyssa asks Lumio and Haven if they only have relationship with other furries, or whether they have a furry relationship versus a human relationship. Haven says that he would be open either way, as long as he feels that they're going to get along in general, then it doesn't matter. Marcus says that he's seen explicit furry adult content, explaining how they wear the ears and tail, but that's as far as he's seen. He says he's never seen two people in costumes, and he asks if that is a thing. Haven says that it does happen, but not as often as people think. He goes on to explain that there are people who enjoy the adult aspects of it, and he thinks it's okay, but it's not the sort of level of debauchery that people think it may be. Lumio goes on to say that the main misconception would be that furry is only a kink, but he says it's not. He says it's an interest, it can be a lifestyle, it can be whatever you want it to be. Lumio says that for him personally, it's about self-exploration and self-expression. Haven says that people think furries are the worst of the worst, that they don't have anywhere else to go and so they sort of fall into the fandom, but it's entirely untrue. He thinks furries are some of the best of what they have to offer society as people and as their characters. Back with Alyssa, Haven says that furries may come across as kinda weird before you get to know them, but furries come from all walks of life and all professions. He mentions doctors, lawyers, engineers, psychiatrists, and psychologists. Lumio chimes in by mentioning a famous chemist, Dr. Uncle Kage. Marcus wonders if there are any big-name celebrities that are actually low-key furries. Lumio and Haven say that there are, and Marcus says that he doesn't want to out them if it's a big deal. Lumio explains to Alyssa that furries who own fursuits make up about 15% of the fandom. He tells her that she probably has someone in her social circle who is a furry. Joni says that she thinks that she's halfway on her way to being a furry, and Haven encourages her to create a fursona, and she agrees that she should do that. Haven gives Marcus the prompt, if you were to wake up tomorrow as an animal, what animal would you be? Marcus thinks about it for a bit before answering that bears are good at swimming, but that it'd have to be a bear with the ability to fly. Joni says that she's into elephants at the moment and jokes that it would work perfectly for her size. Marcus says that he'd want to be some sort of flighted bear that could swoop in and grab salmon. Alyssa says she relates to a phoenix because she's been through a lot, but she still managed to pull herself back up. Joni suggests being a beautiful, colorful sloth that sleeps a lot. Marcus says he doesn't know what to call his flying bear character, and Lumio and Haven say that the next step is picking a name. Joni wants the name to have a lot of S's so that it'll all flow like sloth. Marcus asks whether people do regular names, like a giraffe named Darius. Lumio and Haven respond yes. Haven says that he keeps coming up with silly Buffy names for Alyssa. Haven suggests the name Sasha for Joni's character, and Joni instantly agrees on the name, Sasha Sloth. Back with Alyssa, Haven says that he keeps coming back to the name Xander, but trying to feminize it. Alyssa suggests Zandy, and they all seem to like the name Zandy the Phoenix. Marcus says he can't think of a name. Haven suggests putting together a name by combining the street that you grew up on and first pet's name. Marcus comes up with the name Melrose Polly, and Melrose Polly the flying bear squirrel is born. From here on out, the video begins to wrap up with final statements from all of the participants overlaid with B-roll footage of the locals hugging the furries goodbye or striking poses with them. Lumio says that what the community means to him is a sense of family, saying that sometimes people come from families that can be abusive, so it's nice to have a family that really does care about them and allows them to be who they want to be. We see Marcus hugging Haven and Lumio goodbye, and Marcus says that the furries were super sweet. Alyssa says that it's really unfortunate that furries have such a negative stereotype against them because they're just wonderful people who want to go out, escape, and make everyone else happy, and she thinks that's a wonderful thing. We see footage of her hugging the furries. Joni says that she thinks people who don't think it's a good idea probably have a hard time being their authentic self, because if you can be who you are and have fun, life is a lot more enjoyable. We also see footage of Joni getting hugs from Lumio and Haven. We come back to Haven, who says that you can probably find what you feel is missing in your life in this particular fandom and within the community. As Marcus strikes one final pose with the furries, we have voiceover of him saying not to judge anybody, even if they're dressed up like an animal that doesn't exist, because they're probably nice, and it's not all about sex. Now let's take a look at those review stats. Information accuracy is 100%, and the spirit is also 100%, giving us an average of, you guessed it, 100%. Congratulations, BuzzFeedVideo! And now time for my thoughts. I think Furry Surprise Strangers for the first time had a really interesting format because not only do the Portland locals have a chance to meet a couple of furries in person, but they are also able to bring their preconceptions to light and then address them head on, especially in Marcus's case. He had an opportunity to ask about the adult stuff and get an honest answer, and it seems like this whole interaction changed his mind about furries. I think how a person reacts when they learn new information speaks volumes about their character, and in my book, Marcus, Alyssa, and Joni all seem like really cool people. I think the premise behind this was a neat idea for a standalone video, but I would have loved to have seen this expanded into a full series, maybe with cosplayers or something, but let's get into the video itself. Lumio provided a great definition for what a furry is, and I'll directly quote him here. The furry community is essentially enthusiasts of anthropomorphic animals, which means animals with human-like characteristics. That's the simplest definition for what a furry is. I can't put it any better. You don't need a fursuit or a fursona to be a furry. While I'm on the topic of defining furry lingo, a fursona is a unique animal character that a furry creates to represent themselves. While not every furry has a fursuit, most furries do have fursonas, but you don't even need one to call yourself a furry if you don't want one. Conversely, I think that if you don't want to be a furry, it doesn't matter how much furry content you consume or create, you're not going to become a furry by accident. Joni brought up an interesting point about how Lumio is not covered with fur, and Lumio responds that he's a scaly, which is not an uncommon thing in the furry fandom. Some scalies base their personas on dragons, modern-day reptiles like lizards, or even dinosaurs. Hey, I've always wondered, are there bird furries? Yes, they're called avians or featheries, depending on who you ask. Later in the video, Marcus asks the furries if how they're dressed is how they see themselves, and Haven answers yes, clarifying that it's called a fursona. Neither the video nor the furries really define the term fursona, but I think it's pretty easy to tell what they mean based on the context in which it's used. If anything, the locals got a great hands-on experience in creating their own fursonas, which I think might just be the best way to really understand what a fursona is and get a glimpse of what it's like to be a furry. Alyssa asked the furries where they usually go in character, and the two respond that they've gone to conventions, parades, and charity events, and indeed it's not uncommon for fursuiters to wear their suits in places that they've mentioned. Furry conventions often raise funds for local charities by holding charity auctions. Hey, how much have furries given to charity through the years? You know, Sam, I don't know, but I sure would love to. I did find that MidwestFurFest 2019 raised $112,352 for the charity Felines and Canines, which was matched by an anonymous donor for a total of $224,704. So then we get to Marcus asking about the ethnic makeup of the furry fandom, and the furries say that it's predominantly white, and they also say that the furry community is very open across the spectrum of LGBT. From what I can tell, Haven and Lumio were correct about the makeup of the furry fandom. An international survey conducted by the International Anthropomorphic Research Project in the year 2020 found that 78.6% of furries were white, while 1.6% of furries were black, another 1.6% were indigenous or native, 15.3% were East Asian, 3.2% were Hispanic, 0.7% were from the Middle East, and another 0.7% were from Central Asia or India. As far as sexual orientations, the IARP's findings in a summer 2020 online survey found that 28.8% identified as lesbian, gay, or homosexual, 10.1% identified as straight or heterosexual, 23.4% identified as bisexual, 16.5% identified as pansexual, 10.5% identified as asexual, 4.9% responded something else, and 5.8% responded I don't know. It looks like Haven and Lumio were indeed correct. The data seems to suggest that furries are mostly white, and a wide diversity of sexual orientations are represented within the fandom. Makes mention of room parties, and as far as I know, the definition that is given is correct. Room parties commonly occur alongside furry conventions, and even alongside other conventions like anime or comic conventions. In fact, the earliest furry meetups happened in room parties at science fiction conventions, and eventually gave rise to the very first furry convention. So what goes on in a room party anyway? Well, Sam, I've never been to one, but from what I understand, a room party can be anything from a group of folks watching a movie, playing a multiplayer video game, or just playing board games. Some conventions may have rules as to how room parties are to be conducted, but other conventions don't seem to mind as long as they don't get any complaints. Haven says that he's found that people in the furry community are more likely to open up because they all exist as their characters. Once again, I can't help but think of the quote from Oscar Wilde. "Man is least himself when he talks in his own person. Give him a mask and he will tell you the truth." As I've said before, Oscar Wilde obviously wasn't talking about furries when he wrote that, but I think there still is some truth to it, even outside of the furry fandom. People dress for the job they want and filter their speech while they're in the office, they choose to play as video game characters with abilities that they don't have in real life, or they may even create an online persona that differs from who they are offline. A fursona is just another kind of avatar, and I think the biggest difference is that it doesn't have to be restricted to any particular social setting. Don't get me wrong, there are still places where acting furry is not socially acceptable, but a furry could still pretend to be their persona in a way that is still appropriate for the situation. For example, some furries who are shy have personas that are outgoing and confident, and pretending to be that confident persona could help them with something like public speaking. Alyss asks whether or not furries date outside of the fandom, and from what I know, there's really no expectation for a furry to only date within the furry community or anything. I think my own viewpoint on the matter is similar to Haven's. If someone really loves you for who you are, it won't matter to them that you're a furry. I don't think anyone should feel like they have to hide who they really are from the person they're going to spend the rest of their life with. Marcus asks about the adult stuff and whether or not it really happens. Haven says that it does happen, but not as often as people might think. He then says that there are people who enjoy the adult aspects of furry, and that's okay. Lumio says that the main misconception about furry is that it is a kink, but he says that it's an interest. It can be a lifestyle, it can be whatever you want it to be. Now, I'm not a fan of football in the slightest, but even I know that the average Cowboys fan doesn't go to the game only for the cheerleaders. The same is true for furries. Some furries are into the adult stuff, some aren't, and both are perfectly valid ways to be a furry. The furries explain to Alyss that furries come from all walks of life and all sorts of professions, such as doctors, lawyers, engineers, psychiatrists, and psychologists, which is true. Furries really can come from all backgrounds and professions. In fact, some of the researchers who work in the IARP are furries themselves. Lumio mentions that one of the most famous furries in the fandom is Dr. Uncle Kage. Dr. Samuel Conway, or Uncle Kage as he is known to many in the furry fandom, holds a doctorate in chemistry from Dartmouth College, and he has authored 11 professional publications and 2 patents, one for a way of treating hepatitis B, and the other for recyclable packaging material. Yeah, isn't he also like the president of the furry fandom? No, Dr. Conway is the chairman of Anthrocon, which is one of the biggest and longest running furry conventions, and he has also established a good rapport with the local community of Pittsburgh, especially with the local media. I really do believe that a lot of the progress that has been made for how furries are perceived outside of the fandom is because of his hard work. Samuel Conway is one of the most important figures in the furry community, but he's not the leader of the community because there's no hierarchy to the furry fandom. That makes sense? Yeah, I got it now. Alright, well, let's get back to the video then. Lumio explains to Alyss that about 15% of furries own fursuits. Is that really so? Well, I checked what the IARP had to say, and it turns out he got it right. The IARP has found that about 10 to 15% of all furries own fursuits, and only about 25% of furries own a partial fursuit. What's a partial fursuit? A partial fursuit almost always includes a head, tail, and hand paws. It can include any combination of additional parts, but as long as the costume does not fully cover the person wearing it, it's still considered a partial fursuit. My fursuit is a partial fursuit. I'm just not wearing my tail or feet paws right now. Then we see Haven and Lumio help Alyss, Marcus, and Joni to create and name their own personas. I thought it was really interesting seeing the various reasons why they chose the animals they did. It can be a reflection of who they are or who they want to be, or it can just be an animal that they think is cool, which is exactly how furries create their personas. As the video begins to wrap up, Haven says that you can probably find what you feel is missing from your life in the furry fandom. Okay, how is furry not a religion then? What? Well, here it sounds like furry has all the answers to life's problems. I see what you mean. So, a lot of people have found that the furry fandom provides a way to alleviate some of their problems or to help them heal from past trauma in a way that maybe they haven't been able to find anywhere else. Other people join the furry fandom just for fun, and that might just be all they get out of being a furry, and that's still perfectly valid too. Furry doesn't have a set of beliefs, cosmology, rituals, or morals that furries are expected to follow. The most that the furry community expects of its members is that they don't be jerks, which is no different from any other group out there. What about having a persona? Well, did it seem like there was any spirituality involved when Haven and Lumio were helping them to make their own personas? No, I don't think so anyways. I think that's because there is nothing inherently spiritual about creating a character that uniquely represents you. Now, I'd like to preface this next bit by saying that, as far as I know, this is not a commonly held opinion in the furry fandom, so take it with a grain of salt. I think sometimes there's a moment early on when a new furry is figuring things out where everything just kinda clicks. I had such an experience in my early days of being a furry. I sort of knew what furries were, and I knew I enjoyed furry webcomics, but I hadn't applied the term furry to myself, until one of my friends asked me point blank if I was a furry. And I knew at that moment that I was one. And for me, that was where the whole world of furries sort of opened up for me, and the rest of the day was in, like, Technicolor. Sadly, I don't remember the exact date, but I definitely remember how I felt that day. Do you consider furry to be spiritual, Abergwine? It was a deeply meaningful moment for me, and definitely in my top 10 best days of my life, but I don't consider it to have been a spiritual experience, nor do I personally consider furry to be spiritual. I can definitely see how someone with a similar experience might interpret it as spiritual, and there are furries who do combine furry with their own beliefs, but in my experience, it's not really all that common for furries to do this. Overall, I think BuzzFeed did a great job on their video, Furries Surprise Strangers for the First Time. Sure, BuzzFeed hasn't had the best reputation for the kind of content they're known for publishing, but you know what? I'd much rather see them post videos of furries like this one than rely on misconceptions or outright lies to get more eyes on their content. This video provided an opportunity for Alyssa, Marcus, and Joni to open up a dialogue with the furries and hopefully come away with a better understanding of the furry community. And I'm pretty sure y'all have figured this out already, but this is the sort of content that I love seeing. And I cannot thank BuzzFeedVideo enough for encouraging this kind of understanding and just spreading good vibes. Y'all did an awesome job. Well, that's it for today's episode of Furries in the Media. Have fun, stay awesome, bye-bye.